Martha and Henry, a loving elderly couple, had spent their lives together, facing challenges with grace and dignity. But one ordinary stop at a gas station turned into a nightmare when a group of rowdy bikers started harassing them, spewing insults and pushing them to their limit. As they tried to keep calm, something happened that no one could have predicted. A cop nearby was silently watching everything unfold. Officer Daniels saw the injustice but waited, watching carefully. What he did next would change everything. How did this couple end up being the target of such cruel bullying, and what happened next that led to the bikers being brought to justice in a way no one saw coming? Stay tuned to find out. But before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if Martha and Henry's story of strength and justice speaks to you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The sun-drenched highway stretched out before them, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the rolling countryside. Henry's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Beside him, Martha sat quietly, her silver hair neatly tucked beneath a colorful scarf. The couple had been driving for hours, but neither seemed to mind the journey. 50 years, Henry mused, breaking the comfortable silence. Can you believe it, Martha? 50 years of marriage. Martha's eyes crinkled as she smiled, reaching out to pat her husband's arm. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, doesn't it? Other times, it feels like we've lived 100 lifetimes, Henry finished, chuckling softly. The car hummed along, carrying them towards their anniversary destination. This road trip had been months in the planning, a chance to revisit old haunts and create new memories. For Henry and Martha, it was more than just a vacation. It was a celebration of their endurance, their love, and the life they had built together against all odds. As they drove, memories flooded back, some sweet, others bitter. Martha's mind wandered to their early days, when holding hands in public could invite scorn, or worse. She remembered the marches, the sit-ins, the constant fear that nipped at their heels like a hungry dog. Remember that diner in Alabama? Henry asked, as if reading her thoughts. The one where they wouldn't serve us. Martha nodded, her expression a mix of sadness and pride. And you stood up and said, "We'll wait as long as it takes." We sat there for hours until that young waitress finally brought us coffee, Henry added, a hint of triumph in his voice. Sometimes all it takes is one person to do the right thing. They fell silent again, both lost in thought. The landscape outside the window changed, small towns giving way to open fields, then back to clusters of buildings. Each mile brought new reflections, reminders of how far they had come and how far the world still had to go. You know, Henry, Martha said after a while, I've been thinking about all the kindness we've seen over the years. Remember Mrs. Johnson, how she'd bring us casseroles every Sunday after church? Henry nodded, a warm smile spreading across his face. Or Mr. Tanner at the hardware store always gave us a fair price, even when others wouldn't. There's been a lot of good, Martha agreed, but her voice held a note of caution. Still, Henry echoed, understanding her unspoken concern. The shadow of racism, though diminished, had never fully disappeared from their lives. It lurked in sidelong glances, in clutched purses, in doors that somehow always seemed to close just as they approached. As the afternoon wore on, Henry noticed the gas gauge dipping low. We should probably fill up soon, he said, scanning the roadside for signs. We'll make it quick, he assured Martha, sensing her unease. As they approached Oakville, the change was palpable. The houses grew sparser, replaced by vast fields and the occasional dilapidated barn. Confederate flags fluttered from a few front porches, a sight that made both Henry and Martha shift uncomfortably in their seats. The gas station appeared on the outskirts of town, a weathered building with peeling paint and ancient pumps. Henry pulled in slowly, parking beside one of the pumps. For a moment, neither of them moved. We'll be fine, Henry said, squeezing Martha's hand. It's just a quick stop. As Henry stepped out of the car, the air felt heavy with more than just the summer heat. Martha watched through the window as he made his way to the pump, his movements slow but deliberate, shoulders squared against an invisible weight. Just then, the door to the station shop swung open, and a young man in a faded uniform stepped out. He couldn't have been more than 20, with a mop of unruly hair and a smattering of freckles across his nose. "Afternoon, sir," the young man called out, his voice friendly. "Need any help with that?" Henry paused, surprise flickering across his face. "No, thank you, son. I can manage." The young man nodded, but instead of retreating inside, he grabbed a squeegee and bucket. "Mind if I clean your windshield?" "No charge, of course. Just trying to keep busy." Martha watched the interaction carefully, her hand on the door handle, ready to intervene if needed. But as she observed, she saw nothing but genuine kindness in the young man's demeanor. "That's mighty kind of you," Henry said, a hint of warmth creeping into his voice. "What's your name, son?" "Bobby, sir." "Bobby Jenkins." The young man extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Henry shook it. As Bobby set to work on the windshield, easy conversation began to flow. Martha, feeling more at ease, rolled down her window to join in. "So, Bobby," she said, "have you worked here long?" Bobby grinned, revealing his slightly crooked front tooth. "Going on 2 years now, ma'am. It's not much, but it helps pay the bills." 2 years is a long time for someone so young, Henry observed. "You must be a hard worker." A shadow passed over Bobby's face, quickly replaced by a determined smile. "Have to be, sir. Grew up on the wrong side of the tracks, as they say, but I'm working my way up, saving for college, if you can believe it." Martha's heart warmed at the young man's ambition. "That's wonderful, Bobby. What do you want to study?" "Engineering, ma'am. Always been good with machines." He patted the old gas pump affectionately. "Even got this old girl running smoother than she has in years." As they chatted, Martha couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between Bobby's friendly demeanor and the tension they had felt upon entering the town. It was a poignant reminder that kindness could be found in unexpected places. "You two on a trip?" Bobby asked, finishing up with the windshield. Henry nodded. "Anniversary celebration. 50 years. Bobby's eyes widened. 50 years? That's amazing. Congratulations! His enthusiasm was infectious, and Martha found herself smiling genuinely for the first time since they had entered Oakville. "Thank you, Bobby. It's been quite a journey." The peaceful afternoon at the gas station was shattered by the thunderous roar of motorcycle engines. Henry, who had been quietly pumping gas into their car, looked up to see a group of bikers rolling into the station. Their arrival was like a storm, loud and impossible to ignore. At the head of the pack was Jake, a man whose very presence seemed to suck the air out of the place. His leather jacket was adorned with patches that spoke of a life lived on the edge of society. Behind him, 5 other bikers followed, each looking as rough and intimidating as their leader. Bobby, the young attendant, visibly tensed as the bikers pulled up to the pumps. He'd seen them before and knew the trouble they could bring. His eyes darted nervously between the newcomers and Henry, who stood his ground, continuing to fill his tank. Jake dismounted his bike with a flourish, his boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud. He surveyed the scene, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Henry. A smirk played at the corners of his mouth, one that spoke of cruel intentions. "Well, well," Jake drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Looks like we got ourselves some out-of-towners." His crew chuckled, the sound grating in the tense atmosphere. Henry didn't respond, focusing instead on the task at hand. But Jake wasn't one to be ignored. He sauntered over, his swagger exaggerated, meant to intimidate. "Didn't your mama teach you it's rude not to say hello?" Jake taunted, stepping into Henry's personal space. Inside the car, Martha watched the scene unfold with growing anxiety. She'd seen this dance before, knew the steps all too well. Her hand hovered over the door handle, ready to intervene if needed. Henry finally looked up, meeting Jake's gaze steadily. "Afternoon," he said simply, his voice calm and measured. Jake's smirk widened. "Oh, it speaks. And here, I thought you might not understand English." The racist undertone was clear, and it hit Henry like a physical blow. But decades of experience had taught him how to weather such storms. He remained silent, replacing the gas pump and screwing the cap back onto his car's tank. "What's the matter, old man? Cat got your tongue?" Jake pressed, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Or maybe you're just not used to being around civilized folk." Henry turned to face Jake fully, his stance proud despite the weight of years and hardship. "I've been around all sorts of folk in my time," he said evenly, civilized and otherwise. The implied insult wasn't lost on Jake. His face darkened, the smirk replaced by a scowl. "You trying to say something, old man?" Behind Jake, his crew had dismounted their bikes and were forming a loose semicircle. The tension in the air was palpable, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. Martha, unable to sit by any longer, opened her car door. "Henry," she called, her voice tight with worry, "I think we should be going now." Jake's attention snapped to Martha, and his cruel smile returned. "Oh, but the party's just getting started. Why don't you join us, sweetheart? I'm sure we could show you a real good time." Henry's jaw clenched at the lewd suggestion. "That's my wife you're talking to," he said, his voice low and warning. "Your wife." Jake feigned surprise. "Well, ain't that sweet? Tell me, darling, what's a nice lady like you doing with an old—" He didn't get to finish the sentence. Henry stepped between Jake and the car, effectively blocking Martha from view. "That's enough," he said firmly. "We'll be on our way now." Jake's amusement vanished, replaced by a cold anger. "You don't tell me when it's enough, boy," he spat, the racial slur hanging in the air like poison. The use of that word, boy, hit Henry hard. It transported him back to darker times, to struggles he thought were behind him. But the pain was quickly replaced by a deep, simmering anger. Martha, seeing the change in her husband's demeanor, quickly got out of the car. She moved to Henry's side, placing a calming hand on his arm. "It's not worth it, dear," she murmured. "Let's just go." Jake watched this interaction with growing irritation. He wasn't used to being dismissed, especially not by people he considered beneath him. "Yeah, listen to your woman," he sneered. "Run along now. We don't want your kind around here anyway." Henry took a deep breath, ready to respond, but Martha's grip on his arm tightened. She knew her husband, knew the fire that burned within him. But she also knew the dangers of this situation. They were outnumbered and far from home. Bobby, who had been watching the confrontation with growing unease, finally found his voice. "Mr. Jake," he said, trying to keep his tone respectful despite his disgust. "Maybe you and your friends could move your bikes. They're blocking the pumps." Jake turned his glare on Bobby. "You telling me what to do, boy?" Bobby swallowed hard, but stood his ground. "No, sir. Just trying to run a business here." Jake stared at Bobby for a long moment, then burst into laughter. "Listen to him, boys, trying to run a business." He turned back to Henry and Martha. "You hear that? The help is getting uppity these days." Henry felt his anger rising again at Jake's treatment of Bobby. The young man had shown them nothing but kindness, and now he was being degraded for simply doing his job. "The young man is right," Henry said, his voice firm. "You're disrupting his business. Why don't you and your friends move along?" Jake's amusement vanished in an instant. He stepped closer to Henry, using his height to try and intimidate the older man. "You trying to tell me what to do, old-timer?" Henry didn't back down. He'd faced worse in his time, had stared down fire hoses and police dogs. This bully didn't scare him. "I'm suggesting you show some respect," he said calmly, "to the boy running this station, and to my wife and me." Jake's face contorted with rage. He wasn't used to being stood up to, especially not by someone he considered inferior. His hand clenched into a fist, and for a moment, it seemed he might swing. In a swift motion, he reached out and knocked Henry's hat off his head. The hat fell to the ground, landing in a small puddle of oil. The other bikers laughed, a harsh, grating sound that seemed to echo across the gas station. Henry looked down at his hat, then back up at Jake, his expression unchanged. "Pick it up," Jake commanded, his voice low and threatening. Martha's grip on Henry's hand tightened. "Henry, don't," but Henry was already moving, slowly bending down to retrieve his hat. As he reached for it, Jake's boot came down, narrowly missing Henry's fingers and splashing more oil onto the hat. "Oops," Jake said, feigning innocence. "Clumsy me?" As Henry straightened up, his hat in hand, he said, "Thank you for returning my hat." His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath the gentleness. Jake blinked, clearly thrown off by Henry's composure. He had expected fear, anger, maybe even tears. This quiet dignity was something he didn't know how to handle. Growing increasingly frustrated by Henry's lack of reaction, Jake decided to change tactics. He turned his attention to Martha, his eyes roving over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "How about you, sweetheart?" he leered. "You got anything to say? Or does the old man do all the talking for you?" Henry tensed, instinctively moving to shield Martha from Jake's gaze. But Martha stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. "I have plenty to say," she replied, her voice steady despite her fear. "But I was taught not to waste my words on those who aren't worth hearing them." A chorus of oaths rose from Jake's crew, more than one of them snickering at their leader's expense. Jake's face darkened, his amusement turning to anger. "You better watch your mouth, woman," he growled, taking a menacing step forward. As the confrontation escalated, Bobby, the gas station attendant, watched from the sidelines, his heart racing. He wanted to help, knew he should do something, but fear kept him rooted to the spot. Jake's reputation in the town was infamous. He and his crew had been involved in everything from petty vandalism to more serious crimes, but somehow they always managed to avoid any real consequences. Rumor had it they had connections in the local police department, which made them practically untouchable. Bobby's hands clenched into fists at his sides as he watched Jake harass the kind elderly couple. He thought about the friendly conversation he'd had with them earlier, how they'd shown genuine interest in his life and aspirations. It wasn't right, what was happening to them now. But as Bobby watched Jake and his crew intimidate Henry and Martha, he felt torn. He wanted to help, wanted to be the kind of man his father would be proud of, but he was also afraid. Jake wasn't someone you cross lightly, and Bobby had heard stories of what happened to people who got on his bad side. What if he lost his job? What if Jake and his crew came after him or his family? The gas station job wasn't much, but it was all that was keeping a roof over his mother's head since his father passed. Could he really risk all that? Yet, as he watched Henry stand tall in the face of Jake's intimidation, saw the quiet strength and dignity in both Henry and Martha, Bobby felt something shift inside him. He remembered how they had treated him with respect and kindness, how they had shown genuine interest in his dreams of going to college. In that moment, Bobby made a decision. He might not be able to stop Jake and his crew entirely, but he couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. "Mr. Jake," he called out, his voice shaky but growing stronger with each word. "I think that's enough. These folks are customers, and they have every right to be here." Jake turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Bobby. The young attendant felt a chill run down his spine, but he stood his ground. "What was that, boy?" Jake asked, his voice dangerously low. Bobby swallowed hard but pressed on. "I said, that's enough. Please leave these people alone." Jake stared at Bobby for a long moment, then burst into laughter. His crew joined in, their cruel mirth echoing across the gas station. Well, Jake sneered. "Looks like we got ourselves a hero." He took a step toward Bobby, his posture menacing. You might want to think real careful about what you're doing here, kid. Wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen to you or your mama now, would we?" Bobby felt the color drain from his face. Jake's threat was clear, and for a moment, he regretted speaking up. But then he caught sight of Henry and Martha watching him, concern and gratitude mingling in their eyes. He thought of his father again, of the lessons he'd been taught about standing up for what's right. Taking a deep breath, Bobby squared his shoulders. "I'm not trying to be a hero, Mr. Jake. I'm just doing my job and treating people with respect, like my pa always taught me." At the mention of his father, Bobby's voice grew stronger. His dad had been well respected in the community, even by tough guys like Jake. Invoking his memory now felt like calling on a protective spirit. Jake's smirk faltered for a moment, a flicker of something, perhaps respect, perhaps memory, passing across his face. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual sneer. "Your pa ain't here to protect you now, boy," Jake growled. "So, unless you want to find yourself out of a job, or worse, I suggest you shut your mouth and mind your own business." Bobby felt his resolve wavering under Jake's threat. He glanced at Henry and Martha, saw the worry in their eyes, not for themselves now, but for him. He looked back at Jake, at the malicious grins on the faces of his crew, and felt a wave of despair wash over him. What could he, a simple gas station attendant, really do against men like these? As if sensing Bobby's internal struggle, Henry spoke up. "Son," he said, his voice gentle, but carrying a strength that made everyone turn to look at him, "you've already done more than enough. We appreciate your kindness, but don't put yourself in harm's way on our account." Martha nodded in agreement, adding, "We've dealt with men like this before, dear. Don't worry about us." Their words, meant to reassure Bobby, had an unexpected effect on Jake. He turned back to the elderly couple, his face contorted with rage. "Dealt with men like us before?" he spat. "You think you know how to handle the situation, old man? Let me tell you something. You ain't seen nothing yet." With a nod to his crew, Jake moved to surround Henry and Martha more tightly. The couple stood their ground, hands clasped together, facing the threat with a united front. Bobby watched in horror as the situation escalated. He knew he should do something, anything, to help, but fear kept him rooted to the spot. He felt ashamed of his inaction, knowing his father would be disappointed in him. But what could he do against Jake and his entire crew? As Jake raised his hand as if to strike Henry, time seemed to slow down for Bobby. In that moment, he saw his father's face again, heard his voice, clear as day. "Sometimes, son, doing the right thing means being scared and doing it anyway." Taking a deep breath, Bobby made his decision. He might not be able to physically stand up to Jake and his crew, but there was something he could do. Quietly, while everyone's attention was focused on Henry and Martha, Bobby slipped back into the gas station office. His hands shaking, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. The direct line to Officer Daniels, the one cop in town who seemed immune to Jake's influence. "Officer Daniels," Bobby said quietly into the phone, his eyes never leaving the scene outside. "It's Bobby, down at the gas station. We got a situation here. Jake and his crew, they're harassing an elderly couple. It's bad, sir, real bad. We need help." As he hung up the phone, Bobby felt a mix of relief and fear wash over him. He'd done something, taken a stand in his own way. But he knew that when Jake found out, and Jake always found out, there would be consequences. Stepping back outside, Bobby saw that the situation had escalated further. Jake was now practically nose-to-nose with Henry, spitting threats and insults. Martha stood beside her husband, her face pale, but determined. Officer Michael Daniels pulled his patrol car to a stop just out of sight of the gas station. He had been on his way back to the station when the call came in about a disturbance. As he peered through the windshield, he could see the group of bikers surrounding an elderly couple. His jaw clenched at the sight. Daniels had only been in this small town for a few months, transferred from the bustling streets of Chicago. The change had been a culture shock, to say the least. Here, in the sleepy southern town, the crimes were different, the tensions more deeply rooted, and the politics, well, the politics were a whole other beast. As he watched the scene unfold, Daniel's mind drifted back to his father's words on his first day at the police academy. Remember, son, the badge isn't just a piece of metal. It's a promise to protect and serve everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from. Sometimes that promise will cost you, but it's a price worth paying. His father, James Daniels, had been a legend in the Chicago PD, known for his unwavering integrity. He had stood against corruption within the force, even when it cost him promotions and made him unpopular among his peers. But he never wavered, never compromised his principles. It was a legacy that Michael felt both proud and burdened to uphold. Now, as he watched Jake and his crew intimidate the elderly couple, Daniels felt that familiar internal struggle. He knew Jake's reputation, knew the biker had connections in town that made him virtually untouchable. Stepping in now could jeopardize Daniels' standing in the department, maybe even his job. But how could he call himself his father's son if he stood by and did nothing? Daniel's hand hovered over the door handle, his mind racing. He needed to assess the situation carefully. Rushing in might only escalate things, potentially putting the elderly couple in more danger. But every second he waited felt like a second too long. He watched as Jake got in the old man's face, his body language aggressive and threatening. The old woman, his wife, Daniels assumed, stood nearby, her face a mask of worry and fear. Yet there was a strength in her stance, a resilience that spoke of years of facing down such hatred. Daniel's gaze shifted to the young gas station attendant. The boy, Bobby, if he remembered correctly, looked torn, his body language screaming of internal conflict. Daniels had met Bobby a few times since coming to town, had seen the potential in the young man. But the smile faded quickly as he saw Jake shove the old man. That was it. It was time to act. Daniels stepped out of his car, adjusting his hat and straightening his uniform. He took a deep breath, channeling every ounce of authority he possessed. Then, with purposeful strides, he approached the scene. That's enough. His voice boomed across the gas station, causing everyone to freeze. Step away from them, Jake. Jake's head snapped around, surprise quickly replaced by a sneer. Well, if it ain't Officer Daniels, come to join the party. Daniels kept his face impassive as he closed the distance. I said, step away. All of you. Now, for a moment, it seemed like Jake might comply, but then that cocky grin spread across his face again. Now, officer, no need to get all worked up. We're just having a friendly chat with our new friends here. Ain't that right, old-timer? The elderly man didn't respond. His eyes locked on Daniels, a mix of relief and weariness in his gaze. Daniels turned his attention fully to Jake. Last warning, Jake. Step away, or I'll have you all brought in for disturbing the peace, harassment, and anything else I can think of on the way to the station. Jake's grin faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. Come on, Daniels. You know how things work around here. Why don't you just head on back to your car and let us finish our conversation? The implication was clear. Jake was used to the local police looking the other way, whether out of fear or because they were on his peril. But Jake had severely underestimated Michael Daniels. Things work differently now, Jake, Daniels said, his voice low and dangerous. I don't care who you think you know or what strings you think you can pull. Right now, you're harassing these people, and that stops immediately. Jake's face darkened, the facade of friendliness dropping away. You're making a big mistake, Daniels. You really want to do this for them? He jerked his thumb toward the elderly couple. Daniels didn't blink. No, Jake. The mistake was yours the moment you decided to harass innocent people. Now, I won't tell you again. Back off. The tension in the air was palpable. Daniels could see Jake's crew shifting nervously, clearly not used to being challenged like this. But Jake wasn't backing down. You know what, Daniels? I don't think I will back off. What are you going to do about it? Huh. Arrest me? On what charges? Daniel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Well, let's see. Harassment, disturbing the peace, threatening behavior. Oh, and let's not forget attempted assault when you shove this gentleman here. That's just for starters. I'm sure I can come up with more on the way to the station. Jake's face contorted with rage. You've got nothing, and you know it. It'll be my word against theirs. And we both know how that'll go down in this town. Actually, Daniel said calmly, it'll be your word against mine. As a sworn officer of the law, my testimony carries a lot of weight. And unlike some, I don't have a history of lying under oath. The jab hit home. Jake's face flushed red, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. For a moment, Daniels thought he might actually take a swing. Part of him almost hoped he would. It would make arresting him that much easier. But then one of Jake's crew, a wiry man with a scraggly beard, made a crucial mistake. In a moment of panic or misguided loyalty, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a switchblade. Time seemed to slow down. Daniel saw the glint of metal, heard the collective gasp from the onlookers. Without hesitation, he moved. In one fluid motion, Daniels closed the distance between himself and the man with the knife. His hand shot out, gripping the man's wrist and twisting sharply. The switchblade clattered to the ground as the man yelped in pain. On your knees, Daniels barked, using the man's momentum to force him down. Hands behind your back. The rest of the bikers stood frozen, clearly shocked by the sudden turn of events. Jake's face had gone pale, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. As Daniels cuffed the man with the knife, he called out, "The rest of you, hands where I can see them." Now, slowly, reluctantly, the bikers raised their hands, all except Jake, who stood rooted to the spot, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. "Jake," Daniels said, his voice deceptively calm, "I'm only going to say this once. Put your hands where I can see them, or you'll be joining your friend here on the ground." For a long moment, Jake didn't move, his eyes darting around, perhaps looking for an escape route, or maybe hoping for some miraculous intervention. But none came. Finally, with a snarl of defeat, Jake raised his hands. "This isn't over, Daniels," he spat. "You've made a big mistake." Daniels ignored the threat, focusing instead on securing the scene. He could hear sirens in the distance. Backup was on its way. Good. He'd need help processing all these arrests. As he moved to cuff Jake, Daniels became acutely aware of the elderly couple still standing nearby. The woman had moved to her husband's side, clutching his arm tightly. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief at the scene unfolding before her. "Ma'am, sir," Daniels called out, keeping one eye on Jake as he secured the cuffs. "Are you all right? Are either of you hurt?" The old man shook his head. "We're fine, officer. Thank you." His voice was steady, but Daniels could hear the slight tremor beneath it, the shock of what had just happened. "Henry," the woman said softly, her voice quavering, "perhaps we should—" "It's all right, Martha," the man, Henry, assured her. "It's over now. We're safe." Daniels felt a pang in his chest at the woman's obvious distress. How many times had they faced situations like this? How many times had they been harassed, threatened, made to feel unwelcome simply because of the color of their skin? As backup arrived and the other officers began processing the scene, Daniels made his way over to Henry and Martha. "I'm Officer Michael Daniels," he said gently. "I'm so sorry you had to experience this. I'd like to take your statement if you're up for it, but if you need a moment, that's completely understandable." Martha managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Officer Daniels. You were very brave." Daniels shook his head. "No, ma'am. I was just doing my job. You two are the brave ones, standing strong in the face of such hatred." Henry's eyes met Daniels, and in that moment, a wordless understanding passed between them. Two men generations apart, both fighting the same battle for justice and equality. "We've seen worse," Henry said quietly, "But it never gets easier." Daniels nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "I can only imagine. But please know, as long as I'm here, I'll do everything in my power to make sure nothing like this happens again." As he took their statement, Daniels couldn't help but reflect on the gravity of what had just transpired. He had taken a stand, drawn a line in the sand. There would be consequences. He knew Jake's threats weren't idle. Jake did have connections, and Daniels had just made some powerful enemies. But looking at Henry and Martha, hearing their story of a lifetime, facing down such hatred with dignity and strength, Daniels knew he had made the right choice. His father's words echoed in his mind. The badge is a promise. Today he had kept that promise. As the scene began to clear, Daniels noticed Bobby hovering nearby, his face a mix of awe and anxiety. "Bobby," he called out, "can I have a word?" The young man approached nervously. "Yes, Officer Daniels? I want to commend you for making that call," Daniels said quietly. "It took real courage to stand up to Jake and his crew, even indirectly. And I want you to know that if you ever face any retaliation for what you did today, you come straight to me. Understand?" Bobby nodded, standing up a bit straighter. "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir." As Bobby walked away, Daniels turned back to Henry and Martha. "Is there someone I can call for you? Someone to come pick you up?" Henry shook his head. "No, thank you, officer. We'll be all right. We've come this far. We can make it a little further." Martha squeezed her husband's hand, a gesture that spoke volumes about their years together, the strength they drew from each other. Daniels nodded, respecting their resilience. "All right. But please, if you need anything at all, don't hesitate to call the station and ask for me." As Henry and Martha prepared to leave, Daniels watched them with a mixture of admiration and sadness. They had faced so much, endured so much, and yet here they were, still standing tall, still moving forward. His gaze drifted to the patrol cars, where Jake and his crew were being loaded up. Jake caught his eye, his face twisted with hatred. "This isn't over, Daniels," he shouted. "You'll regret this." Daniels didn't respond. He didn't need to. His actions today spoke louder than any words could. As the last of the patrol cars pulled away, Daniels found himself alone at the gas station. The events of the day weighed heavily on him. He knew he had just painted a target on his back. The coming days and weeks wouldn't be easy. But as he climbed into his own patrol car, Daniels felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had done the right thing. He had lived up to the legacy his father had left him. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same courage and integrity he had shown today. Daniels started his car, ready to head back to the station and face the mountain of paperwork that awaited him. But before he pulled out, he took one last look at the gas station in his rearview mirror. This small, unremarkable place had become the stage for a pivotal moment, not just in his career, but in the ongoing struggle for justice and equality in this town. It was a small victory, perhaps, in the grand scheme of things, but small victories added up. They had to. As he pulled onto the road, Daniels made a silent promise to himself, to Henry and Martha, to Bobby, and to every other person in this town who had ever faced discrimination or injustice. He would continue to stand up, to fight the good fight, no matter the cost, because that's what the badge meant. That's what it meant to be his father's son. And that's what it meant to be a true guardian of justice in a world that so desperately needed it. The road stretched out before him, leading back to the station, where he knew a storm was brewing. But Daniels was ready for it. He had made his choice, had taken his stand, and come what may, he would face it head-on with the same courage and conviction he had shown today. As he drove, Daniels couldn't help but think about Henry and Martha. Their strength, their dignity in the face of such ugliness, had left a profound impact on him. He wondered about their story, about the lives they had lived, and the challenges they had overcome. In that moment, Daniels made another silent promise. He would find a way to reach out to them, to learn from them. Their experiences, their wisdom, could be invaluable in his efforts to bring about real change in this town. The sun was setting as Daniels pulled into the station parking lot. He sat in his car for a moment, gathering his thoughts, preparing himself for the battle ahead. He knew that his actions today would have repercussions. There would be those in the department who wouldn't understand, who might even see his intervention as a betrayal of some unspoken code. But as he stepped out of his car and walked towards the station doors, Daniels felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had sworn an oath to protect and serve all people, regardless of their race, creed, or color. Today, he had lived up to that oath in the truest sense, and that Daniels knew was a cause worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Officer Michael Daniels sat at his desk, the harsh fluorescent lights of the police station casting long shadows across the incident report he was filling out. The events of the afternoon played on repeat in his mind as his pen scratched across the paper, detailing the confrontation at the gas station. He had been at the station for hours now, processing the arrest of Jake and his crew, fielding calls from superiors, and deflecting not-so-subtle hints that he should reconsider his course of action. But Daniels remained resolute. He knew he had done the right thing, even if it meant making powerful enemies. As he signed off on the last of the paperwork, a knock on his office door made him look up. It was Captain Reynolds, his face a mask of carefully controlled neutrality. "Daniels," the captain said, his voice gruff. "A word." Daniels nodded, bracing himself for what he knew was coming. He followed Reynolds into his office, closing the door behind him. The captain settled into his chair with a heavy sigh, fixing Daniels with a hard stare. "You've stirred up quite the hornet's nest today." "I was just doing my job, sir," Daniels replied evenly. Reynolds leaned back, his chair creaking under his weight. "Your job, huh? And tell me, does your job involve making enemies of half the town? Because that's what you've done today." Daniels felt his jaw clench, but kept his voice steady. "With all due respect, sir, my job is to protect and serve all members of this community." "That's exactly what I did today." The captain's eyes narrowed. "You arrested Jake Hawkins and his entire crew. Do you have any idea who Jake's connected to in this town?" "I'm aware of the rumors, sir," Daniels said, "but that doesn't change the fact that they were harassing an elderly couple and brandishing a weapon when confronted." Reynolds rubbed his temples, looking suddenly tired. "Daniels, I'm going to be straight with you. There are people in this town, powerful people, who aren't happy about what you did today. They're calling for your badge." Daniels felt a chill run down his spine, but he stood his ground. "And what do you think, Captain?" For a long moment, Reynolds was silent, studying Daniels with an unreadable expression. Finally, he spoke. "I think you're either the bravest or the most foolish cop I've ever met. Maybe both." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Listen, Daniels, I've been in this town a long time. I've seen how things work here. It's not always pretty, but it's kept the peace." "At what cost, sir?" Daniels countered. "At the cost of allowing people like Jake to terrorize innocent citizens." Reynolds held up a hand. "I'm not saying it's right, but it's the reality we've been dealing with. You can't just come in here and upset the whole apple cart in one day." Daniels felt his frustration rising. "So what would you have had me do? Stand by and watch as they harass that couple?" "Of course not," Reynolds said, a hint of irritation creeping into his voice. "But there are ways to handle these situations without making powerful enemies. A warning, maybe, or a minor charge that wouldn't stick." Daniels shook his head. "That's not good enough, sir. Not for me. I took an oath to uphold the law and protect the people of this town. All the people. I intend to honor that oath no matter who it upsets." Reynolds stared at him for a long moment, then let out a heavy sigh. "You remind me of myself when I first started on the force, full of ideals and determination to change the world." His expression softened slightly. "I admire your conviction, Daniels, I really do. But this job has a way of wearing you down, of making you see shades of gray where you once saw only black and white. Daniels met the captain's gaze steadily. I understand that, sir, but I can't just turn a blind eye to injustice. I won't. Reynolds nodded slowly. I figured you'd say that. Well, I'll do what I can to run interference with the higher-ups, but I can't promise anything. You've made some powerful enemies today. Daniels, watch your back. As Daniels turned to leave, Reynolds called out to him. And Daniels, for what it's worth, I think you did the right thing today, even if it's going to make both our lives a hell of a lot more complicated. Daniels felt a small smile tug at his lips. Thank you, sir. That means a lot. As he walked back to his desk, Daniels felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him. Relief that the captain seemed to be on his side, at least to some extent, anxiety about the repercussions he would face, but mostly a sense of renewed determination. He had taken a stand today, had lived up to the ideals his father had instilled in him. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on. Settling back at his desk, Daniels' gaze fell on a small, framed photo. It was of him and his father, taken on the day Daniels had graduated from the police academy. His father's face beamed with pride, his arm around his son's shoulders. Daniels felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at the image. I hope I made you proud today, Dad, he whispered. Just then, his phone rang, startling him out of his reverie. He picked it up, his voice professional. Officer Daniels speaking. Officer Daniels? The voice on the other end was hesitant, familiar. This is Bobby. Bobby Jenkins from the gas station. Bobby, yes. Is everything all right? There was a pause, and Daniels could hear Bobby take a shaky breath. I don't know, sir. I've been getting some strange calls, and when I left work, I could swear someone was following me home. Daniels felt his stomach tighten. He had been so focused on the potential backlash against himself, he hadn't considered the danger Bobby might be in. Bobby, listen to me carefully. Are you at home now? Yes, sir. Good. Lock all your doors and windows. Don't answer the door for anyone. I'm on my way. As Daniels hurried out of the station, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The events at the gas station had set something in motion, something that threatened to unravel the delicate balance of power in this small town. He had a sinking feeling that Bobby was about to become collateral damage in a war he never asked to be part of. The drive to Bobby's house was tense, Daniels' mind racing with possibilities. He knew Jake had connections, knew there were people in town who wouldn't take kindly to their comfortable status quo being disrupted. But would they really go after a young gas station attendant? As he pulled up in front of Bobby's modest home, Daniels scanned the street carefully. Nothing seemed out of place, but years on the force had taught him that appearances could be deceiving. He approached the front door cautiously, one hand resting on his holster. Bobby, he called out. It's Officer Daniels. Open up. The door cracked open, revealing Bobby's pale, anxious face. Officer Daniels, thank God you're here. Once inside, Daniels did a quick sweep of the house while Bobby hovered nervously nearby. Tell me exactly what happened. Daniel checked the back door's lock. Bobby ran a hand through his hair, his voice shaky. After you left the gas station, I started getting these calls. At first, they were just hang-ups, but then someone started talking, saying I should have kept my mouth shut, and that I didn't know who I was messing with. Daniels felt a surge of anger. Did you recognize the voice? Bobby shook his head. No, sir. It was muffled, like they were using something to disguise it. And you said you thought someone was following you? Bobby nodded, his eyes darting to the window. On my way home, there was this car, a black sedan. It stayed a few cars behind me the whole way. When I pulled into my driveway, it drove past real slow. I couldn't see the driver. The windows were tinted. Daniels absorbed this information, his mind already formulating a plan. All right, Bobby, here's what we're going to do. You're going to pack a bag, just essentials. You're coming with me. Bobby's eyes widened. Where are we going? Somewhere safe, Daniels replied. I've got a friend who owns a cabin just outside of town. You'll stay there until we get this sorted out." As Bobby went to pack, Daniels made a quick call to his old academy buddy, arranging for the use of his cabin. He knew he was taking a risk, potentially overstepping his authority, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Bobby's safety depended on his actions now. Once Bobby was ready, Daniels led him out to his car, keeping a watchful eye on their surroundings. It was a good thing Bobby's mama was out of town visiting her sister, so Bobby wouldn't have to worry about her. As they drove through the quiet streets, Daniels couldn't help but reflect on how quickly things had escalated. What had started as a simple intervention at a gas station had ballooned into something much larger, something that threatened to expose the deep-seated corruption and prejudice that lurked beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful town. They drove in silence for a while, the darkness of the countryside enveloping them as they left the town limits. Finally, Bobby spoke up, his voice small in the quiet car. "Officer Daniels, can I ask you something?" Daniels glanced over at him. "Of course, Bobby. What is it?" Bobby hesitated, fiddling with the strap of his backpack. "Why are you doing all this for me? I mean, you don't even know me." Daniels was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Because it's the right thing to do, Bobby. You stood up for what was right today, even though it was scary. You showed real courage, and now it's my turn to stand up for you." Bobby nodded slowly, seeming to mull this over. "My dad always used to say that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it." Daniels felt a smile tug at his lips. "Your dad sounds like a wise man." "He was," Bobby said softly, and Daniels caught the use of past tense. They lapsed into silence again, each lost in their own thoughts as the miles rolled by. As they turned onto a dirt road leading into the woods, Daniels couldn't shake the feeling that they were at the beginning of something much bigger than either of them realized. The cabin was small but cozy, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. As Daniels helped Bobby settle in, he laid out some ground rules. Stay inside as much as possible, keep the curtains drawn, and that he would come by every day to check on him and bring supplies. Bobby nodded, looking around the cabin with a mix of anxiety and relief. "How long do you think I'll need to stay here?" Daniels sighed. "Honestly, Bobby, I don't know. Until we can ensure your safety back in town. Until we can get to the bottom of what's really going on." As he prepared to leave, Daniels placed a reassuring hand on Bobby's shoulder. "You did a brave thing today, Bobby. Don't ever forget that. What's happening now is not your fault. It's the fault of those who think they can use fear and intimidation to control others." Bobby managed a small smile. "Thank you, Officer Daniels, for everything." On the drive back to town, Daniels' mind was racing. He knew that hiding Bobby away wasn't a long-term solution. He needed to get to the root of the problem to expose the corruption that allowed men like Jake to operate with impunity. But as he pulled into the station parking lot, Daniels was struck by a sudden realization. He couldn't do this alone. He needed allies, people who shared his commitment to justice and weren't afraid to rock the boat. His thoughts turned to Henry and Martha, the elderly couple from the gas station. They had faced a lifetime of discrimination and injustice, yet they still stood tall and fought for what was right. Maybe they could offer some insight, some perspective on the deep-seated issues plaguing the town. With a newfound sense of purpose, Daniels made a decision. Tomorrow, he would seek out Henry and Martha. He would listen to their stories, learn from their experiences, and together, perhaps they could start to build a coalition of those who believed in justice and equality for all. As he walked into the station, Daniels felt the weight of the day's events pressing down on him. But mixed with the exhaustion and anxiety was a spark of hope. He had taken a stand today and had refused to look the other way in the face of injustice. Though the road ahead would be difficult, he knew in his heart that it was a road worth traveling. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the turmoil Daniels felt inside. He had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of Bobby hidden away in the cabin, of Jake and his crew sitting in jail cells, of the unknown forces moving against him in the shadows. As he sipped his coffee, Daniels formulated a plan. He would start by tracking down Henry and Martha. Their statement from yesterday's incident gave an address, a small house on the outskirts of town. He planned to visit them off the clock and out of uniform. He needed to understand their perspective, to hear their stories unfiltered by the formal constraints of police procedure. Before heading out, Daniels made a quick call to the cabin to reassure Bobby. He could hear the young man's voice on the other end. He sounded tired but safe. Daniels promised to bring more supplies later in the day. As he drove through town toward Henry and Martha's house, Daniels couldn't help but notice the sidelong glances and whispers that followed his patrol car. News traveled fast in small towns, and it was clear that word of yesterday's confrontation had spread. Some faces showed approval, while others displayed thinly veiled hostility. Daniels steeled himself, knowing that the division he was seeing was just the surface of a much deeper rift in the community. He pulled up in front of a modest, single-story house, its paint faded, but the small garden out front meticulously maintained. Taking a deep breath, Daniels approached the front door and knocked. After a moment, the door opened, revealing Martha's surprised face. "Officer Daniels," she said, her voice a mix of confusion and concern. "Is everything all right?" Daniels smiled reassuringly. "Everything's fine. Mrs. Johnson, I hope I'm not intruding, but I was hoping I could speak with you and your husband for a few minutes off the record." Martha hesitated for just a moment before her face softened into a warm smile. "Of course, come in, and please call me Martha." As Daniel stepped inside, he was struck by the warmth of the home. Photos lined the walls, telling the story of a long life lived with love and perseverance. Henry sat in an armchair by the window, looking up from his newspaper as Daniels entered. "Officer Daniels," Henry said, his voice strong despite his age. "This is an unexpected pleasure." Daniels shook Henry's offered hand, feeling the strength still present in the older man's grip. "Please call me Michael. I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced." "Not at all," Martha said, gesturing for Daniels to take a seat. "Can I get you some tea or coffee?" "Perhaps tea would be wonderful, thank you," Daniels replied, settling onto the couch as Martha bustled off to the kitchen. Henry fixed Daniels with a penetrating gaze. "Something tells me this isn't a social call, Michael. What's on your mind?" Daniels leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You're right. It's not just social. I wanted to talk to you both about what happened yesterday, and well, I was hoping to hear more about your experiences in this town." Henry's eyebrows rose slightly. "Our experiences? That's quite a broad topic, young man." Martha returned with a tray of tea, setting it down on the coffee table. As she poured, she asked, "Why the sudden interest in our experiences, Michael?" "Because I think they're important. What happened yesterday at the gas station wasn't an isolated incident, was it?" Henry and Martha exchanged a look, a lifetime of shared experiences passing between them in that single glance. "No," Henry said finally, his voice heavy with memories. Martha settled into her chair, cradling her teacup. "We've lived in this town for over 40 years, Michael. We've seen a lot of changes, some for the better, some not so much." Henry nodded, his eyes distant with memories. "When we first moved here, it was tough. We were one of the first black families in the neighborhood. People weren't shy about letting us know we weren't welcome. But we stood our ground," Martha added, reaching out to squeeze her husband's hand. "We believe that by living our lives with dignity and determination, we could change hearts and minds." Daniels leaned forward, captivated by their story. "And did you change hearts and minds?" "I mean," Henry chuckled softly, "some. Over time, we made friends. Good friends. People who saw us as neighbors, as fellow human beings, not just as a color. But there were always others," Martha said, her voice tinged with sadness. those who held on to their prejudices, who passed them down to their children, like Jake and his crew. Daniels murmured in agreement. Jake's father was one of the loudest voices against us when we first moved in. Looks like the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Daniels took a sip of his tea, processing this information. So, the incident at the gas station is part of a much deeper problem, a problem with deep roots. Henry confirmed, but Michael, what you did yesterday was a step in the right direction. For the first time in a long while, we felt like someone in authority was truly on our side. Daniels felt a mix of pride and determination swell in his chest. I meant what I said yesterday. As long as I'm here, I'll do everything in my power to ensure everyone in this town is treated fairly and with respect. Martha smiled warmly. We believe you, Michael, but it won't be easy. There are powerful forces in this town that benefit from the status quo. I'm starting to realize that, Daniel said, thinking of his conversation with Captain Reynolds. But I can't just stand by and watch injustice happen. I won't. Henry leaned forward, his eyes intense. Then you'll need allies, Michael. People who share your vision for a better, more just community. Daniels nodded. That's actually part of why I'm here. I was hoping you might be willing to help me understand the lay of the land, who the key players are, who might be willing to stand up for what's right. Henry and Martha exchanged another look, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Martha spoke. We'd be honored to help, Michael, but you need to understand the risks. Standing up to the established order in this town can have consequences. I'm prepared for that, Daniel said firmly. Whatever the cost, it's worth it to build a community where everyone feels safe and respected. Over the next hour, Henry and Martha painted a picture of the town's complex social and political landscape. They spoke of other families who had faced discrimination, of small business owners who had stood up for equality at great personal cost, of young people eager for change but unsure how to make it happen. As Daniels listened, he felt a plan beginning to form in his mind. A coalition of concerned citizens working together to bring about positive change in the community. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but it was a start. As he prepared to leave, Daniels felt a renewed sense of purpose. Thank you both, he said, shaking their hands warmly. Your insights are invaluable, and your courage, well, it's inspiring. Martha smiled, her eyes twinkling. We're just happy to see a young man like yourself taking up the fight, Michael. It gives us hope for the future. Henry nodded in agreement. Remember, son, change doesn't happen all at once. It's a slow process, often 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But every small victory counts. Daniels nodded, taking their words to heart. I'll remember that and I'll be in touch. We're going to make a difference in this town together. As he drove away from Henry and Martha's house, Daniels' mind was racing with possibilities. He had a lot of work ahead of him, but for the first time since the incident at the gas station, he felt truly hopeful. Over the next few weeks, Daniels threw himself into his work with renewed vigor. By day, he performed his duties as a police officer with unwavering integrity, earning the respect of many in the community. By night, he worked tirelessly to build the coalition he had envisioned. He started small, reaching out to those Henry and Martha had identified as potential allies. A local teacher who had been pushing for a more inclusive curriculum, a small business owner who had faced backlash for hiring minorities, a group of high school students who had been trying to start a social justice club. Slowly but surely, the coalition began to take shape. They met in living rooms and community centers, sharing stories, brainstorming ideas, and planning actions to promote equality and justice in their town. But as the movement grew, so did the opposition. Daniels faced increasing pressure at work, with some of his fellow officers giving him the cold shoulder. Anonymous threats began to appear, slipped under his apartment door, or left on his car windshield. Through it all, Daniel stood firm. He thought often of his father, of the legacy of integrity he had inherited. He thought of Henry and Martha, of their lifetime of quiet resistance, and he thought of Bobby, still in hiding, a young man whose life had been upended because he dared to do the right thing. The turning point came about a month after the gas station incident. Jake's trial was approaching, and tensions in the town were at an all-time high. Daniels had just finished a long shift and was heading to his car when he noticed something wasn't right. As he approached, he saw that all 4 tires had been slashed. Spray painted across the side of the car in angry red letters were the words "Race Traitor." Daniel stood there for a long moment, a mix of anger and determination coursing through him. This was meant to intimidate him, to make him back down. Instead, it only strengthened his resolve. He pulled out his phone and snapped a picture of the vandalism. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he posted it on social media with a simple message: "This is what standing up for justice looks like in our town. Who will stand with me?" The response was overwhelming. Within hours, the post had been shared thousands of times. Messages of support poured in from all over town and even from neighboring communities. People Daniels had never met were offering to help repair his car, provide security, and join his coalition. The next day, as Daniels was overseeing the repair of his car, he was approached by a familiar face. It was Captain Reynolds, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Daniels," he said gruffly, "got a minute?" They walked a short distance away, out of earshot of the mechanics working on the car. "I saw what happened to your car," Reynolds said. "It's not right." Daniels nodded, waiting to see where this was going. Reynolds sighed heavily. "Look, Daniels, I owe you an apology. When you first came to this town, I thought you were naive. I thought you'd either learn to play along or wash out. But I was wrong." He met Daniels' eyes squarely. "What you're doing, it's what we all should have been doing all along, and I want you to know that from now on, you have my full support." Daniels felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He extended his hand, which Reynolds shook firmly. "Thank you, Captain. That means a lot." As news of the vandalism spread, it seemed to awaken something in the town. People who had been sitting on the sidelines began to speak up. The coalition grew rapidly, with new members joining every day. The day of Jake's trial arrived, and Daniels was prepared for the worst. But as he approached the courthouse, he was met with an incredible sight. Hundreds of people had gathered, forming a human chain around the building. They were of all ages and races, and many held signs with messages of support for Daniels and calls for justice. As Daniels made his way through the crowd, he was stopped again and again by people wanting to shake his hand, thank him, and offer their support. He saw Henry and Martha there, beaming with pride. He saw Bobby, finally able to come out of hiding, standing tall among his fellow citizens. The trial itself was almost anticlimactic. With so many witnesses willing to testify, and with the town's support so clearly behind Daniels, Jake and his crew didn't stand a chance. They were convicted on all counts. As Daniels left the courthouse that day, he knew that this was just the beginning. There was still so much work to be done, so many hearts and minds to be changed. But for the first time, he truly believed it was possible. In the months and years that followed, the town underwent a transformation. The coalition Daniels had helped build worked tirelessly to promote equality and justice. They pushed for reforms in the police department, advocated for more inclusive education, and worked to bridge the divides that had long separated different parts of the community. It wasn't always easy. There were setbacks and moments of frustration. But slowly, surely, change began to take hold. 5 years after the incident at the gas station, Daniels stood at a podium in the town square. Behind him was a newly unveiled statue depicting 2 clasped hands, one black and one white. It was a monument to unity and the power of standing together against injustice. As he looked out over the crowd, Daniels saw familiar faces. Henry and Martha, older now, but still radiating strength and dignity. Bobby, now in college studying law, determined to continue the fight for justice. Captain Reynolds, retired but still a staunch ally. And there were new faces too, young people who had grown up in a town that was learning to embrace diversity and equality, families who had moved to the area drawn by its reputation as a welcoming community. Daniels cleared his throat and began to speak. 5 years ago, a simple act of standing up against injustice set us on a new path. It wasn't an easy path. It required courage, determination, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. But look at where it has led us. He gestured to the diverse crowd before him. Today, we stand united, not perfect, not without our challenges, but committed to the idea that every person deserves respect, dignity, and equal treatment under the law. As he concluded his speech, Daniels felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the courage of those who had stood with him from the beginning, gratitude for a community that had found the strength to change, and gratitude for the legacy of his father, whose lessons in integrity and justice had guided him every step of the way. The crowd erupted in applause, and as Daniels stepped down from the podium, he was engulfed in a sea of handshakes and hugs. In that moment, surrounded by the community he had helped to transform, Officer Michael Daniels knew that he had truly honored his badge and the promise it represented. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but Daniels was ready to face them because he knew now more than ever that when good people stand together, real change is possible. And in this small town that had found the courage to confront its past and reshape its future, that change was just beginning. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring tales and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done if you were in Officer Daniels' shoes?